Hey guys, welcome back to my Animal Adventures YouTube channel, and in this episode I want to talk to you about the temperatures surrounding your ball pythons or your reptiles. And especially if you have a reptile room like this, it can definitely be a challenge keeping and maintaining consistent temperatures throughout your racks and throughout your rooms. And as a matter of fact, if you look on the internet, there's a lot of variability in the recommendations for certain temperatures, and I want to show you what my recommendations are and show you some of the challenges that I have in keeping those temperatures. Okay, first I want to show you this enclosure that I have for my reticulated python, and this one is almost a no-brainer. It's so easy to control the temperature. I actually have a hot spot underneath, right underneath here, and then I have a heat panel from above. And the heat panel is like a radiant heat panel, and there's a little temperature probe in the back that controls the temperature from the top, and it controls the temperature from the bottom. And in this, you really don't have to mess with the temperatures in the room at all. It always pretty much stays at the temperature that you set it. I actually have the top at 82 degrees, and it just happens to be the temperature that this particular snake likes at the moment. If I turn up too high, she tries to push out of the cage. If I turn it down too low, she kind of coils up and huddles under that hot spot. And I found 82 is about perfect. And then I also have a hot spot of 88 underneath, and I don't think it reaches 88 on the actual substrate, but it does keep her warm underneath, and it's warm enough between the bottom and the top that I never ever really have to worry about having to mess with the temperatures in here. Unlike if you had like a rack in a room, then you really have some issues, and I'm going to talk about those issues coming up here. Okay, so I want to point out this hatchling rack right here, and I actually have hatchlings from the top to the bottom all the way down. And what I actually have here on this rack, it's pretty dusty up here because I haven't really been up here. This is kind of the neglected part of the rack. But I have a heat controller, and it's set at 90 degrees, and the probe is at 90. And the probe is actually down in the middle on one of these levels in the back on the heat panel. So on the very back, there's a metal heat panel that's several inches wide, and it just heats on the back. So the hot spot on this rack is 90 degrees, and then the front is basically the ambient. And the problem is that if you set one level in the middle at 90, the top and the bottom are actually going to be cooler than 90, which is pretty interesting. And we can actually take a heat gun and kind of take a look at this. So if we pull one of these tubs out, and I just kind of move the substrate, and then we take a temperature reading of the substrate. This one is actually pretty close. It's about 89. And I haven't actually checked these before, so this is kind of interesting for me to actually see where these temperatures are. And pretty much what I do is I just set them and go. I don't even really mess with them. Here's one I've been assist feeding, and the temperature here, in the bottom of the tub, that is at 81. That's really cold. And it might even be a little warmer in the middle of the rack. Let's take a look at this one. See if I can do this without getting bit. Alright, buddy. Don't bite me, whatever you do. Alright. Let's see. Yeah, so we're at 83 degrees in that tub. So you can see there's quite a variability, from 83 to 89 throughout the whole rack. Okay, so on this rack, this is my female rack over here. I have all my female breeders, and I definitely didn't want the variability in my rack for my females. I wanted them all to hit a 90-degree hot spot. And take a look at this. If you come up here on my little step stool, what I actually have up here is a heat controller for every single level. I have levels over here, and then I actually have another one over here, and I keep them all at 90, and they're all individually controlled, so I don't have the heat variability throughout this rack. So I have another rack over here. This holds my males, and it's basically set up just like my hatchling rack. I set it to 90 degrees, and it's a little bit different from the top to the bottom, and I'd say right in the middle is pretty much spot on for 90, close to it. And I actually have one female in here that I'm breeding. That's my Desert Ghost male and female that I'm pairing up this year. I almost have to move them to a bigger tub. They really fill these tubs, and this is their first year breeding, so they're not really massive snakes. But I would say if you're breeding in a system like this where you have just the temperature controller on one level, I would definitely put the breeding females on that level and put your males around it, because the males don't really need that much of a temperature control. Okay, so in addition to the variability of the temperatures across a rack system like this, you also have the different recommendations for temperatures by different breeders. And when I first started getting into ball pythons, I basically learned almost everything from watching YouTube videos. And I'd watch some YouTube videos and someone would say, oh yeah, use this temperature for the hot spot, this temperature for the ambient. And I was like, alright, I have to write that down, and I'd write it down, and then I'd watch another video and it was different, and another video and that one was different. As a matter of fact, I watched some videos from the same breeder, and 3 years down the road, they changed their mind and started using different temperatures. And some of them, you know, did the night drops and all that. And it was really complicated and really confusing. And one thing they have to realize with the temperatures is that it's pretty much not consistent across different breeders. And what I kind of try to target in here is a 90-degree hot spot. That's pretty much what I have all my hot spots set to. And then I use an 82 degrees ambient. And 82 was pretty much in the range of what some breeders did pretty much year-round, and it also was pretty much the maximum temperature for me as a comfort level working in the snake room. And you watch some of these videos, and people would walk into a breeder's reptile room, the snake room, and people would start complaining, wow, it's 95 degrees in here, it's way too hot. And I don't really think that you need temperatures that hot. As a matter of fact, I had a really successful breeding year last year. I kept my temperatures the same throughout the whole year. It was a 90-degree hot spot, and it was 82-degree ambient, and I didn't change any temperatures at all throughout the whole year. And I had very successful breeding year with a lot of hatchlings. Okay, so one of the things that really brought the temperatures into the forefront this week is that the thermostat for my heat controller actually went out in this room. And I walked in here the other day and it was 92 degrees in here. I couldn't believe it, and it was actually my little Jumpstart heater. And this is the third one that actually went out. And if you've seen these little Jumpstarts, they're pretty inexpensive, but you definitely don't want to run space heaters on them. They only handle like 800 watts, and my space heater is 1500 watts. And I found out 3 times the charm, I'm not going to use those thermostats anymore. There's actually a greenhouse thermostat that I'm going to use that can handle up to 2000 watts, and it's similar to that, but it has a dial instead of a digital display. So what really got me thinking about the temperatures this week is that when that thermostat went out, the Jumpstart actually has a temperature probe on it, and I was messing around with the temperature probe, and I finally dialed in my space heater, just manually moving the little knob to where it was exactly 82. And then I was messing around with the thermostat and it actually dropped to the floor, and I left it there. And I came in here and I looked at the temperature, and it was actually 72 degrees. I couldn't believe there was that much of a difference between the floor and about, you know, eye level. And eye level it was 82, and as a matter of fact at the ceiling it was 85, and on the floor it was 72. I couldn't believe it. And I actually have some snakes down here that, especially this pastel calico on the very bottom. As a matter of fact, I picked her up this week, and I picked her up and I was like, wow, this snake is really cold. I couldn't believe how cold it was, and sure enough, it was actually in the 70s down here on the floor. And one of the things that I found out, one of the reasons that it was cold is because it was coming from underneath my door. And out here in the room right next to this is actually my basement, and it's not heated very well. It was actually in the low 60s in the basement. And what was happening was the cold air was coming under the door, and I could get down on the floor, you know, with my face, and I could feel the cold air coming in, and it was coming straight in and right to these lower tubs. And what I finally did is I rolled up a towel and put it there, and I think that really helped. But what I think I really need in here is some fans kind of up on the ceiling that will push the air down and give me better circulation. And that's one of the things you really have to look at if you have a reptile room or if you have rack systems, is the temperature of your room from top to bottom. So speaking of temperature fluctuations from the top of the room to the bottom, I actually had the same thing happen in my incubator this year. And I have an incubator that's like 6 feet tall, and it seemed like all the hatchlings on the top hatched a lot faster than the hatchlings on the bottom, and I even had some fans in there to rotate the air, and it still didn't matter. I still struggled with the temperature fluctuations from the top to the bottom of my incubator. Okay, so another thing we should talk about is the temperature of the substrate versus the temperature of the tub. And I've had some people comment on some of my videos, and they say, yeah, we're trying to get the substrate temperature to 90 degrees, so we crank the thermostat to 120. And the problem is if the snake digs down underneath the substrate and hits that hot tub, it could really damage your snake. And I would say probably the maximum temperature you'd want to go for ball pythons is in the mid-90s. And even at the mid-90s, the males you can actually temporarily sterilize your males in the mid-90s, where if you have a bad breeding season and your temperatures may be too hot, I would definitely dial them back to probably the low 90s, or what I'm comfortable with is 90 degrees. And what I do for some of my snakes is what I'll do is I'll dig down a little bit in the substrate. I'm using this coconut husk substrate, and I'll dig all the way down and put the snake directly on the tub, and then I'll kind of backfill, especially if the snake's just kind of hanging out and not really doing anything. And then for some snakes, for example, if I'm breeding some snakes, and I have a couple snakes here that I'm pairing up and breeding, my albino pied male, my clown female, going for the triple hets. And if I'm breeding, typically they're off of food and they don't really need a hot spot to digest, and they're fine with the ambient. So typically what I'll do is I'll put them directly on the substrate without digging down and having them directly on the tub. Okay, so one last thing you really want to take into account when you're thinking about which temperature to use for your ambient temperature. You also have to think about what else do you have in the room and what is the temperature requirement for those animals as well. So for example, I actually have some frogs here, some Pac-Man frogs, and I have a pixie frog. I have some mealworms and some superworms, a little colony of roaches, and especially if you're thinking about frogs and Pac-Man frogs in the mid-80s, mid to upper 80s, you can actually kill your frogs. If, for example, when my heater stuck and I walked in here and it was 92 degrees, I actually, if that would have went on for too long, I could have potentially killed some of my frogs. And it was a good thing I caught it early, and I came in. I come in here several times a day just to make sure everything's going okay, make sure no tubs are flooding, make sure the temperatures are okay, and if anything's out of the normal, I can catch it really quick. And you definitely want to think about which temperature to use as far as everything in the entire room. And for me, 82 degrees is perfect for my frogs and for all my insects, my feeder insects, for all my rats, it works good, and for my snakes, and pretty much across the board, it works for everything that I have. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up my discussion of the temperatures of my reptile room, how I figure out which temperatures to use, and the challenges I face keeping those temperatures stable across the entire room. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.